Hi, everybody. So tonight we are going to talk about um, Civil War in Kansas. Remember the last time we had passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, in which we all agreed that it creates two territories, Nebraska and Kansas. Everybody knew that Nebraska would be a free territory. It was so much further north. Kansas is going to be the stickier one because it's right there on the border of Oklahoma. It's on the border of Missouri, which was a slave state. And so almost immediately, there's a rush to get into Kansas. Uh, you have what we call free state people, or sometimes known as uh, anti-slavery groups, settle in the northern part and try to attract like-minded individuals. And in the southern part, you had pro-slavery people trying to attract people to live in the southern part of Kansas. Well, the Kansas territorial governor arrives in 1854 and he finds thousands of settlers. And so he orders a census and schedules an election for a territorial legislation, which is what you're supposed to do as accordance to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Well, when they have the election, to create the new territorial legislature, uh, it's a disaster. Several thousand so-called border ruffians cross over from Missouri and illegally vote in the polls for the pro-slavery forces. They also pledged to kill every God-blanking abolitionist in the territory. Okay, this is one of those points where you have to remember when people go, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, they're telling you right there, right? They're not saying we're out here to fight for states' rights or whatever. They want to get rid of the abolitionists. Well, the governor denounces the vote as fraud, but does nothing to alter the election results. So this new legislature, which is overwhelmingly pro-slavery, expels the anti-slavery members that were there and adopts a new drastic slave code, which made it a capital offense to aid a future slave, which means execution. It was a felony to question the legality of slavery, because then you're suggesting that it could be illegal. Well, that also tells you something too, right? So much for free speech when they're saying, one, you can't even question the legality of slavery. You could certainly question the morality of slavery, but you couldn't question the legality. And like I said, it's a death penalty offense to offer aid to a fugitive slave. Well, the free state people say, well, this whole thing is bogus. And so they said, we're going to form our own government in the northern part of Kansas. And so by March 1856, there are two governments operating in Kansas. There is a free state government or anti-slavery government in the north, and there's a pro-slavery government in the south. Now, the anti-slavery or free state people are in Lawrence, Kansas. And in May of 1856, about 700 pro-slavery men attack Lawrence, Kansas. This is known as the Sack of Lawrence. They smash newspaper offices. They set fire to the governor's home. They stole property. They destroyed the Free State Hotel, which obviously with that name, they were going to get it destroyed. And one of these people that witnessed this was a fanatical free soiler. He's an interesting character if you read about him. His name was John Brown. Now, John Brown was the father of 20 children. He had two wives. I think the first wife gave him 13 and the other one gave him 7. Brown is an interesting fellow in the fact that he's not only an abolitionist, but he's also a civil rights advocate. When a lot of people in the North talk about abolishing slavery, they're not talking about equal rights. Brown certainly did that. Well, 2 days after the attack on Lawrence, Brown and 4 of his sons and 3 other men attacked a pro-slavery settlement at a place called Pottawatomie Creek. They dragged 5 men from their houses, and then in front of these men's wives and children, hacked them to death with swords. Now, later, John Brown will deny that he ever did that. He was not part of that. He denies it to his Boston friends, but he was. What this does is it sets off a running gun battle throughout Kansas. It's a lot of bushfighting. John Brown has several close shaves, but he does lose a son. His son Frederick is shot and killed. Don't worry, he's got 19 more, I guess. And by the end of 1856, 200 people are dead, $2 million in damages. So it's telling you right early on in 1856, there's a civil war going on in Kansas over the issue of slavery, and people are dying in 1856. And this violence spills over into the United States Senate. The day before the raid on Lawrence, Kansas, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts had given a speech on the Senate floor decrying the treatment of Kansas. He said that what was going on in Kansas was the rape of virgin territory, and he blames it on the South. Sumner specifically points out South Carolina Senator Andrew P. Butler. He said Butler was a liar and had kept that quote unquote harlot slavery as his mistress. And he also teased Butler about his speech impediment. Butler recently had a stroke and he had a speech impediment, and Sumner was making fun of that. Now, normally, that kind of rudeness in the Senate would backfire. Normally that it would. But it didn't have a chance to backfire because Butler has a nephew by the name of Preston Brooks, who is in the House of Representatives. Well, he's not going to put up with somebody insulting his uncle, so he goes up to the Senate floor, and Sumner's sitting at his desk. And when Sumner looks up, Brooks smashes him across the face with a cane and then begins beating him with a cane on the Senate floor. Sumner's a big guy. He tries to stand up. He actually pulls his desk off out of the floor. It was bolted to the floor. He pulled off before he fell down. You're asking, why didn't any other senators help him? Preston Brooks had brought a friend with him who had a gun and was pointing at everybody saying, don't dare, you're not getting involved in this. Well, it takes Sumner almost 2.5 years for him to get back on the Senate floor. He's so severely beaten. Massachusetts does not fill that seat as a sign of this is what the South is all about, this kind of brutality. As for Brooks, Brooks is censured by the House. They said, no, you can't go beat up senators. But he resigned. He says, no, you're not censuring me. I quit. I'm leaving. But he goes back to South Carolina, and he's overwhelmingly reelected to Congress. And when he's reelected to Congress, he gets all of these gifts, and you pretty much can guess what those gifts are. They're canes. Southerners saying, we need to beat up some more Yankees as fast as we can. Well, that brings us to the election of 1856. And there's just a lot of themes going on at this time. There was bleeding Kansas, as everybody was calling Kansas at the time with the 200 deaths. There was bleeding Sumner, since Sumner had been beaten. There was also the tone of bully Brooks. So these are the kind of things that were being said during the presidential campaign. The Republicans, that newly formed party, will nominate their first presidential candidate in John Fremont. Fremont had made his name in the Mexican-American War. He was known as the Pathfinder. He was also known as Frontier Fremont. There was a lot of things that they liked about John Fremont. Their platform favored the Transcontinental Railroad. That's pretty easy. Favored internal improvements, which would benefit the West. Condemned the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, appealing to Northerners. And they're going to have a great slogan: free soil, free speech, and Fremont. Hey, that's pretty good. But it's the first time that a major party platform took a stand against slavery. First time. I mean, yes, I know we had the Liberty Party in 1840, but that was a minor party. But now we have a major party here, the Republican Party, saying we don't want slavery expanding. The Democrats reject Franklin Pierce. Remember, we talked about Franklin Pierce, that his son had died on the train when the train had rolled over. His wife never forgave him. Pierce was seen as hapless. And so they go with James G. Buchanan out of Ohio, which, by the way, Ohio is going to be one of the key states going forward here. Ohio and Virginia bringing us a lot of presidents. So they thought about Stephen Douglas, remember, because Stephen Douglas wanted to run for president, but they said, no, Stephen Douglas is too hot of a potato because of that Kansas-Nebraska Act stuff. So they go with James Buchanan. Their platform was they urged Congress not to interfere with slavery in the states or territories. They condemned nativism, which the Republican had a lot to do with that. Republicans at the time were still a bit nativist, didn't like immigrants, and they endorsed religious liberty. This appeals to a lot of Irish voters because, again, a lot of the Republicans and some of the former Whigs were more Protestants and didn't trust Catholics. And so when the election is held, Fremont does carry the northern states, but Buchanan, who's from Ohio, wins thanks to Southern votes. And he believes that the Union can only be held together by making concessions to the South. He owes his office of presidency to the South. And so Republicans just can't stand it. They call him doughface because they say he has no backbone to stand up against the South. He chooses 4 slave state men in his cabinet and 3 free state men. To Republicans, this seems like a very, very bad omen. Interesting about Buchanan, Buchanan is our only ever president never married. He was engaged at one time, it didn't work out, and never got engaged again. And of course, they spread rumors about this for a long time, about him not being married. Well, let's bring up to a Supreme Court case that's going to hasten us to the Civil War, and that's the Dred Scott case. Now, Dred Scott was born into slavery in Virginia about 1800. Let me just give you some backdrop up here about Dred Scott. He was taken to St. Louis in 1830. He was sold to an army surgeon who took him to Illinois, a free state, and then to Wisconsin, a free territory. Finally, returned to St. Louis, Missouri in 1840, a slave state. His master dies in 1843. Now, Scott tries to buy his freedom from the widow. He has some money, but she won't sell. So Scott, being a good American, and we all know what all good Americans do, he sues. He's going to sue. And his argument, and we can follow this argument, is that once he was taken into Illinois and Wisconsin, Illinois a free state, Wisconsin a free territory, that made him free. And he claims that once free, forever free. And he takes this to a Missouri jury trial. And he wins. The jury agrees. But the state Supreme Court overturns that decision and said that a slave state didn't have to honor the freedom granted by free states. So the case goes to the United States Supreme Court and the Chief Justice, Roger B. Taney. Now, you remember Roger B. Taney. Taney's a Virginian. He's a slave owner. He had served in the Jackson administration. And in my government class and even my history class, one of the things I point out is that when the Supreme Court even today makes rulings, don't assume that that's it's all these wise people making rulings. The Supreme Court makes some doozies of mistakes, right? And that's why they issue opinions, not facts. They're issuing an opinion. And this is probably one of the worst Supreme Court decisions of all time. The Supreme Court rules that Scott couldn't sue. He had no standing to sue. He can't bring a case to court because he's not a citizen. He's property. Now that's a bad decision, right? What Taney is saying is that this chair cannot sue because it's property, and he's saying that Scott is no different. Now that's a bad decision. Can Taney make it worse? Yes, he can. I'm going to quote Taney here. He said, blacks, quote, had for more than a century been regarded as so far inferior that they had no rights that the white man had to respect. Okay, well, that's pretty bad. Can it get worse? Yes, it can, because he then says that the Missouri Compromise and even the idea of popular sovereignty were a violation of the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, before you start pulling out your Westlaw Dictionary and trying to figure out what that would be, the Fifth Amendment has the Due Process Clause in there, which says that you cannot be denied of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. And so if you're trying to if the federal government is trying to say, look, you can't take your property, slaves, into these territories, you're violating the Fifth Amendment. So in other words, what what Tawney is doing, he's taking a document that was designed to guarantee freedom, and using it to guarantee slavery. So for Republicans, this is a disaster. They believe that the Supreme Court is now part of what they call the slave power conspiracy. Right? They've already seen Buchanan had all these slave state men and feeling he owes a debt. Now they got the Supreme Court ruling against them. They believe there's this slave power conspiracy. But I think it's an important question to ask is, what about Dred Scott? Well, his former owner, the man who had enslaved him, the widow marries an abolitionist, and Scott is freed in 1857. But he dies a year later of tuberculosis. Okay, this is going to be complicated, so you're going to have to follow me slowly here because, well, I'm not going to go slow, but you have to follow me. Let's go find out what's going on in Kansas. Kansas is still turmoil. Pro-slavery forces meet up in Lecompton, Kansas, and they're going to draw up a pro-slavery constitution so that Kansas can be entered into the Union as a slave state. And they set the vote on the Constitution for December 21st, 1857. Well, free state people, the anti-slavery people, boycott the election, saying, look, this is rigged against us, we're not going to vote in it. And so when it goes to a vote, it's 6,200 and something for and 569 against. So the Constitution passes. But the free state people and the governor call another election. And this time it's 10,000 against and 138 for. Okay, so now you've had two elections. Which one do you accept? It's up to what is the president going to do? What's Buchanan going to do? Well, we know what Buchanan's going to do, right? Buchanan is owing a debt to the South, and so he supports the Lecompton Constitution, which drives a wedge through the Democratic Party. Now Congress has to approve it, and the president rams it through Congress, but Congress delays statehood until 50,000 people live in Kansas. And eventually they'll have a new election rejecting the Lecompton Constitution by 11,000 to 1,700. We'll come back to Kansas. Kansas will become a state after the Civil War. Kansas, quite the mess. Briefly, we want to talk about the Panic of 1857. Now, if you remember, the Panic is a depression. We used to call them panics all the way up until 1929, when Herbert Hoover says, let's not use the word panic because people tend to panic. He said, let's use the word depression. Okay, Hoover, didn't work out well for you. Probably should have thought of something else. So now we have great recessions and things like that. In fact, you think about the pandemic and with the huge unemployment, no one called it anything, right? We didn't call it a recession or depression or anything. Well, the Panic of 1857, a depression, it was brought on by a reduction in demand for American grain by Europe and a surge in manufacturing that outran growth of markets. So the North, this depression blames the South for lowering tariffs, making it harder for them to sell their goods. Cotton falls pretty fast in price, and the South does suffer for it, but they recover very quickly. The North lags behind in recovery from this panic. And for the South, they take this as an interpretation that their way of life, cotton, is king. And so that's why we hear that phrase, King Cotton, that this recession, depression, panic, proved to them that this agricultural society of growing cotton and slavery was the superior way of life to the Northerners. Let's catch up with our friend John Brown. John Brown had become quite the celebrity from a reporter who'd covered the things going on in Kansas and really was almost a propagandist for John Brown. And he was in Boston working with a group called the Secret Six, who were going to fund some of his activities. And one of these activities was that Brown had come up with this idea, and this was to raid Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Now, I know what you're saying. You're saying, Brian, excuse me, I happen to know that Harpers Ferry is in West Virginia. And I'm saying be quiet, because West Virginia wasn't created until 1863, so there. The idea was that Brown thought that if he could get to Harpers Ferry, take the federal arsenal there, where all the guns are, then he believed that a large group of slaves would come to Harpers Ferry, arm themselves, and this would lead to this rolling revolution across the South. Well, he actually talks to Frederick Douglass about it, and Frederick Douglass thinks, no, that's crazy. That's not going to work out. But Brown's not going to listen. Sets up a little base outside of Harpers Ferry. And then on October 16th, 1859, Brown and 19 other men, including 5 African Americans, seize the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry. They take the arsenal by surprise. They take hostages, but they wait. They wait to see when everybody's going to come rally to them, and they don't. The arsenal is quickly surrounded by the local militia. Brown sends one of his sons and another man under a flag of truce, and the crowd shoots them both. And they toss their bodies into the water, and they use them for target practice. Another one of Brown's son is injured. He's gut shot. And of course, you know, if you're gut shot at this time period, it's a slow, painful death. It's just a horrible way to die. His son was suffering greatly, and he asked John Brown, he said, look, would you please just kill me and put me out of my misery? And John Brown replied, if you must die, die like a man. Okay, well, that night, the cavalry, literally the cavalry arrives under Robert E. Lee and his aide, Lieutenant Jeb Stuart, with some Marines. They try to get Brown to surrender. He won't surrender. Brown realizes that he really wants to become a martyr. Even when he had a chance to escape, he chose not to. So the Marines rush the arsenal, knock down the doors. One Marine finds Brown preparing to fire. The Marine stabs him so hard that the sword bends, and then he has to knock Brown unconscious over the head with the butt of his sword. Well, Brown is tried for treason in Virginia. His lawyers tried to get him to plead insanity, saying, look, just tell him you're crazy. And Brown says, look, if I had done what I had done on behalf of the rich of this country, I would be a hero. But because I do it for slaves, I will die for insurrection. And Brown is hanged on December 2nd, 1859. Interestingly enough, one of the people, I mean, they were very careful about this because they didn't want to have a lot of people show up and get out of hand. So very few people were allowed into the hanging. It was the army. And one of the persons that watches this hanging, who had borrowed a uniform and dressed up and acted like a soldier, was John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth hated John Brown. Well, what's the impact of John Brown's raid? Well, it's pretty bad because for the Southerners, they find John Brown's hideout. They find all these letters from the Secret Six, these people in Boston, these wealthy Bostonians. Some of them flee to Canada for a while. One man puts himself in a sanitarium. And this, for the Southerners, is proof in their mind that all of the North, and especially Republicans, are just a bunch of John Browns. They believe that the North is involved in this conspiracy. And so you've got the North believing in the slave power conspiracy, and you've got the South believing that all Northerners are John Brown. Well, let's talk about one last thing here before I let you go tonight, and that's the Lincoln-Douglas debates. This is the senatorial election of 1858. Now, keep in mind, when we say senatorial election, people did not elect your senators, right? You don't elect your senators until the early 20th century with the passage of the 17th Amendment, which allowed for the direct election of senators. By the way, there are a couple politicians today who want to repeal that. Rick Perry's one of them. The idea that his argument is that senators were designed to represent the state government, not necessarily the people, and therefore we should go back to allowing state legislators to appoint senators. But you got two people wanting to be the senator, and one of them is the incumbent, and that's Stephen Stephen Douglas. Douglas wants to run for president in 1860, but it's hard to run for president when you just got beat in your own Senate race. So he's got to secure his home base of Illinois. Well, opposing him will be Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, a little bit of background about Lincoln. We could go on all day, right? I'm pretty sure somebody's written a book about him. He was born in Kentucky in 1807. He's self-educated. He had done a lot of different jobs. He'd operate a ferry, he surveyed, he managed a general store, and he practiced law. He served in the Black Hawk War. I think I mentioned that. He served in the same war as Jefferson Davis. They're both serving in the same war. They never met, but it's interesting. That's how it's going to be. He initially was a Whig, part of the Whig Party, and he supported Henry Clay. In 1842, he had served in the state legislature. He also serves one term in Congress, where he had gotten the nickname Spotty Lincoln for his spot resolutions. So this is interesting. Lincoln and Douglas hold a series of debates. And by the way, if you really want a really good book on this sort of time period, go read Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals. They based the movie Lincoln on part of it, but the book itself is really good. But they hold a series of debates. They get on a train and they travel and they debate. They get up in front of people and they debate. Don't you wish people would do that today? Well, Douglas, he's got a little bit of heat because of that Kansas-Nebraska Act. That's still heat. He's still dealing with that heat about repealing the Missouri Compromise and that sort of stuff. And he's Illinois, free state. That's going to be an issue. So Douglas announces what he calls the Freeport Doctrine, in which asserts that who cares what the Supreme Court says about slavery? You know, when they said that you could not deny them for people from bringing in their property in Dred Scott, he said, look, if a state and a locality doesn't want to have slavery, adopt no laws that protect it, right? So if you move your slaves in there and they run away, the government has no authority to go find them. They wouldn't be supported by local police. And that way, if settlers don't want slavery, don't adopt a local code protecting it. So what this allows is it allows Douglas to sort of reconcile the idea of popular sovereignty, where people could vote to ban slavery, which the Supreme Court said they couldn't, with the Dred Scott decision. Now, Douglas tries to pin Lincoln on this radical idea at the time that Lincoln advocated racial equality. And this is a tough question for Lincoln to handle, but he said that there was a physical difference. According to Lincoln, I'm quoting here, I'll quote specifically, quote, a physical difference between the white and black races. And that would forever forbid the two races from living together on terms of social and political equality. He favored containment where it existed, believing it would eventually die out. Douglas wins, obviously, the election. He's the senator. Lincoln's not a senator. But Lincoln's ability to debate and his speeches make him famous. And he's called on to give speeches in New York and all these other places. And so when we talk about Lincoln and slavery, and we're going to slowly get into it because we're going to start the Civil War next week. When we talk about Lincoln and slavery, Lincoln's position on slavery evolves over time. Certainly, he doesn't start out as an abolitionist. Eventually, he sees abolition as a war aim, and then actually starts supporting the vote for African-American men. So Lincoln this is the beginning of his growth on his views of slavery. So Douglas wins. So that brings us to the election of 1860. The Democrats can't decide. They divide. Northern Democrats nominate Stephen Douglas. Southern Democrats march out of the convention and go nominate their own guy, John Breckinridge of Kentucky. So the last of the national parties had split. I mean, the Democrats were both North and South. Republicans were certainly not South. They had split. The Republicans choose Abraham Lincoln, honest Abe Lincoln, what they call the uncommon common man. Now, to sum this up in a simple way, no one really thought Lincoln would win the convention. It was between William Seward and I believe Salmon Chase, right? It's not Salmon Chase. But the Lincoln men, essentially what they did was they just went to the Seward guy and they go, look, if you guys can't get enough people, and I'm simplifying this pretty dramatically, to support Seward, could your second choice be Abraham Lincoln? They go, yeah, sure. And they went the same way with Chase's men too. Hey, if you can't get it, could your second choice be Abraham Lincoln? Well, eventually it does come to everybody's second choice. And poor William Seward, right? He's in Auburn, New York. You can visit his house. He's got the whole group there, the party, and they're waiting for him to come out and give the speech accepting the nomination. And he doesn't get it, right? They nominate Abraham Lincoln. The platform of the Republicans is, one, they denounced John Brown's raid. They say, no, we don't agree with John Brown's raid. That's wrong. They said states should control its own domestic institutions. Domestic institutions are a word meaning for slavery. But the Republicans are resistant to the extension of slavery into the territories. Lincoln's one of those people who believes that as long as you didn't extend slavery, it eventually would die out on its own. They also wanted higher protective tariff for manufacturers, free homesteads for farmers so people could settle the West, and internal improvements. So this is a platform that's just not random. It's designed to appeal to everybody, Eastern businesses, Western farmers, immigrant populations. That's its whole purpose. And they're going to need all those votes because Southern states will not even allow Lincoln on the ballot. You don't even have the choice to vote for Lincoln, which is amazing. And so Lincoln will get about 38% of the popular vote, but he's going to get the majority of the Electoral College vote. Now, for the Republicans, they had believed that their central view on slavery was that slavery bred two classes of people: corrupt masters, because slavery corrupts those people who enslave other people, but slothful slaves. Obviously, if you're a slave, you're not going to work as hard because you're not earning your own money. You're not free to do so. So Lincoln wins in November of 1860, and almost immediately, South Carolina on December 20th, 1860, will hold a convention and vote to secede from the Union. Now, their first thing that they put in their secession ordinance is they have violated the protection of slavery. Now, they didn't like Lincoln. They called him a black Republican. They hated Lincoln, even though they didn't really know him. There was an assassination attempt on Lincoln, they believed, in Baltimore on his way to his inauguration. But the South Carolina leaves. This is a little bit different than the Jackson era. In the Jackson era, when South Carolina in the nullification crisis was standing up against the tariff, no other state was going to join them. This time, that's going to change. The old saying about South Carolina, again, was too small to be a country, too large to be an insane asylum. And as somebody else once said, the great statesmen are gone. Webster, Clay, Calhoun. We are now in the hands of the fire eaters. And this is going to lead us to Civil War in our next lecture, which hopefully will be exciting.